The year is 45 BC. The month is February. The place is the late Republic of ancient Rome. Marcus Tullius Cicero has just suffered one of life's worst possible tragedies. His daughter Tullia has died after childbirth. Cicero was 62 years old at this time, and he was absolutely heartbroken. In a life that was marked by political upheavals, social chaos, and personal tragedy, this was perhaps, for Cicero, the lowest period in his life. He writes to his closest friend, Titus Atticus, on March 8th, quote, "You are kind, as usual, in wishing that I could get some relief from my grief, but you can bear witness that it is no fault of mine. For every word that has been written by anyone on the subject of assuaging grief, I read at your house. But my sorrow is beyond any consolation. Why, I have done what no one has ever done, tried to console myself by writing a book. I will send it to you as soon as it is copied out. I assure you no other consolation equals it. I write the whole day long, not that it does any good, but it acts as a temporary check, not very much of that. For the violence of my grief is too strong. But still I get some relief, and try with all my might to attain some composure of countenance, if not of mind." End quote. In another letter to Atticus on March 10th, Cicero admits, quote, "Writing and reading do not soften my feelings, they only distract them." End quote. Marcus Tullius Cicero is one of the most celebrated figures from the period of the late Republic. He was known as a great orator and a statesman, and he's renowned throughout history for his robust literary canon. In many ways, Cicero is the definitive Latin philosophical writer. But he was also a political figure who had sided with Pompey and the Optimates in the civil war against Julius Caesar. After the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar pardoned Cicero, and Cicero would thereafter refrain from political activity for a time. He resolved instead to serve his republic through his philosophical writings. Then Tullia died, and Cicero withdrew to the island of Astura, where he had a villa, and combed the writings of the Greek philosophers for help in quieting his raging grief. The book that he speaks of in his letter to Atticus is the Consolatio, or Consolation. This work of Cicero's was apparently well known throughout the Roman Empire, but it didn't survive out of antiquity. A text would later appear in the 1500s, which claimed to be a newly discovered translation of this work, and many believed that it was, because both the style and the content matched that of Cicero, but later scholarship has shown that it was the work of an admirer of Cicero's writings, a pseudo-Cicero from the Renaissance period. What we have instead as the fruit of Cicero's inner crisis is the Tusculan Disputations. In May, Cicero relocated to his villa in Tusculum. Obviously, he's a very rich aristocrat with different properties he can go to, and he penned 5 philosophical dialogues, which he finishes by the end of the summer. He represents the Disputations as a transcript of actual conversations, but it may be the case that this is just a literary conceit. The Disputations are also presented in the form of a letter to his friend Marcus Junius Brutus. It is among Cicero's most important works, and it takes the form of a long series of discourses on the familiar themes of the ancient Greeks, especially the Stoics. The discourses mainly concern the power of virtue to provide reprieve from the passions, and the power of philosophy to make us fearless of death and happy in life. There is thus a consolatory element to the Tusculan Disputations, as we would expect given the recent events in Cicero's life. When the fraudulent consolatio showed up in the 1500s, the ideas there bear very close resemblance to the ideas contained within the Tusculan Disputations, which shows, in a sense, because of the similarity it bears to the Tusculan Disputations, the fact that people tried to pass those ideas off as the Consolatio should show us something, that this was very much still a work searching for the consolation of philosophy. Because Cicero's world had fallen apart, the political ideology of the Optimates had been defeated, and it had been defeated by one of Cicero's chief rivals, not just a political rival, but a rival in the art of oratory. Among the Roman politicians of the late Republic, Caesar was considered probably the only oratorical talent who could match or even outmatch Cicero. Cicero himself admitted this. And as Cicero was writing these disputations, Caesar was concluding the civil war. Caesar would soon return to Rome as its unopposed ruler. And meanwhile, Cicero was so distraught by the loss of his daughter that he built a shrine in her honor and tried to have her deified. And while it does seem that he abandoned this idea in the course of time, again, it speaks to how distraught he was. And as we know from his letters, his immersion into Greek philosophy was a kind of desperate attempt to maintain his composure, or at least just to distract himself from the pain of this most profound of losses that we can experience, the death of a child. And from all accounts, it didn't have totally satisfying results. He's kind of saying, it's failed to console me, and so I'm distracting myself by writing this book. And so Cicero is interesting because he's accounted a great writer. He's not really known for innovating new philosophical ideas, but he's known as a great writer, I think, because he himself struggles through these ideas in his own life. He commits to writing a clear and a compelling articulation of that understanding that he gains through his life experience. We could say he's like an ancient Montaigne, or rather, Montaigne is a Renaissance-era Cicero, as Montaigne was greatly influenced by Cicero, along with, many other great writers of the modern era were influenced by him, including Locke, Hume, Voltaire. And philosophically, Cicero took the side of the Stoics against the predominantly Epicurean attitude of the Roman patricians. But he was equally indebted to the academical philosophy of Plato's Academy. By this time, the Academy had incorporated skepticism as one of its main ingredients. In fact, if we go back about 100 years before Cicero is writing, to a somewhat legendary incident, which Cicero himself commented on, the first Greek philosophers to visit Rome in 155 BC had included 3 representatives. One was from the Peripatetic school, another was from the Stoics, and the third was a representative of the Academy named Carneades. In an infamous incident, Carneades gave public lectures while he was in Rome, even though he was officially just there as an ambassador. His first lecture was in favor of justice, but his second lecture questioned the very concept of justice. The theme of justice is a familiar one for Platonic philosophy, but even though Plato's dialogues often involve, Socrates arguing against interlocutors who expound their own philosophical view that's critical of the concept of justice, and sometimes the matter isn't fully settled, although in the most famous Platonic dialogues like the Republic, it does seem fairly settled to decide in favor of justice, but in any case, it's difficult to imagine Plato himself teaching in this manner, counterposing 2 positions. In fact, that more resembles the tropes of the sophists and the skeptics. And furthermore, there's perhaps an interesting geopolitical background to why Carneades is giving these arguments, and it's difficult to know how that fits into this, because the Greeks were a declining power at this point. The Romans, the whole reason why they went to Rome was to appeal a judgment where Rome was trying to make the Greeks pay back a sum of money to a city-state that they had raided. And so perhaps these meditations on justice, whatever Carneades' conclusion he was building to, perhaps that would be with the intention of persuading the Romans to a certain point of view on justice that might benefit the Greeks. We don't really know, because before Carneades could give his third lecture, the elder Cato reportedly ordered him removed from the city. Or rather, he proposed it to the Senate, and they agreed. And given the date in which Cato argued for this, as a funny historical note, even though we don't have the text of his argument, it's almost certain that he ended that proposal with the phrase, Ceterum censeo Carthago delinda est. Furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. And we can say this because during this period, he ended every speech by saying this. Leaving that aside, we don't know what the third speech of Carneades would have been. Perhaps it would have been a conclusion that ultimately affirms the value of justice. Perhaps it would have been a skeptical conclusion that, emphasizing the need to withhold judgment. Perhaps it would be a proto-Fichtean synthesis of justice and injustice. We don't know. Even the incident itself might be an exaggeration. Now, the reason for this digression is that this can be seen as the beginning of the Roman engagement with Greek philosophy. From the very start, the academical philosophy, the Academy of Plato, was presented to the Romans as moderate skepticism. You kind of have the main schools coming out of Greece being the skeptical school, the Stoic school, and then the Peripatetics, who are Aristotelian and a bit more eclectic with their views. And the Epicureans were always a kind of, we might say, they were always kind of a fringe thing in Greece, and they really take off among the Romans. And so this is the kind of skepticism that the Romans are introduced to, a skepticism that is apparently moderated through the intellectual succession that went through Plato's academy. And that's therefore the kind of skepticism that Cicero tends to engage with. It's the kind of skepticism that Hume would affirm as standing above the Pyrrhonian type, whether Hume was right or wrong to say that. I personally think he wasn't really right to say that, but that's neither here nor there. It's likely that Hume himself was influenced in that attitude by Cicero, because he finds merit in both the Stoic and the academic philosophies, perhaps because they're both practical and they both concern themselves with the pursuit of ataraxia, mental tranquility. Although admittedly, that's not the sole goal of the Stoic. The Stoic sees virtue as the highest good. But we might think of, again, to refer back to David Hume in thinking about Cicero here, we might think about the young David Hume's letter around the time when he was 18, in which he expressed the wish to possess the power of mind to endure any turning of fortune. And there are so many examples of people trying to practice this type of philosophy, especially in the ancient world. Philosophy is a way of achieving mental fortitude or mental endurance against ill fortune and pain and grief and fear of death. Hundreds of years after Cicero, Boethius would write his Consolation of Philosophy, while imprisoned and soon to face execution. The themes are similar, if not identical, but philosophy instructs us in virtue, and virtue safeguards us from mental and emotional disturbance in reaction to the changes we face in life, for good or for ill. As we round the wheel of fortune, philosophy can safeguard us against being dragged down by that, because it's really a matter of our passions. Epictetus would also invoke the example of Socrates, who had faced death fearlessly. And he would declare that if death was something to be feared, then Socrates would have feared it. It is self-evident that philosophy, therefore, has this consolatory power, this power to take away our fear or our enslavement to the passions, because we can see this power at work in the example of Socrates. That's the attitude of Epictetus. In section 5, or in the 5th disputation of Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, he says that it has been no easy thing to trust in the power of philosophy when set against the unimaginable tragedy that he's faced. Quote, "When I reflect on those troubles with which I have been so severely exercised by fortune, I begin to distrust this opinion, and sometimes even to dread the weakness and frailty of human nature. For I am afraid lest, when nature had given us infirm bodies, and had joined to them incurable diseases and intolerable pains, she perhaps also gave us minds participating in these bodily pains, and harassed also with troubles and uneasinesses peculiarly their own." End quote. So, when we look at how frail the human body is, must it not also be the case with the human mind? What kind of incredible strength would it take for the mind to steel itself against ill fortune? But Cicero rallies and expresses a kind of faith in the power of virtue, even if the power is not contained in we ourselves and in our bodies and minds. He represents virtue almost as an external force, in a personified form, as a savior, a metaphorical salvific image of virtue. Quote, "But here I correct myself, for forming my judgment of the power of virtue more from the weakness of others, or of myself perhaps, than from virtue itself, for she herself has everything that can befall mankind in subjection to her, and by disregarding such things, she is far removed from being at all concerned at human accidents, and being free from every imperfection, she thinks that nothing which is external to herself can concern her." End quote. And in the passage that follows, Cicero will do the same for philosophy. He will personify her. And in some sense, philosophy and virtue are the same goddess for Cicero, if we may call her a goddess. Because of, what I would say, we can refer to what Nietzsche called the Socratic formula, that reason equals virtue equals happiness. I think Cicero very firmly believes this. And because the Academy, of course, carries on the Socratic tradition just as much as the skeptical tradition. And the Socratic philosophy is entirely concerned with human life and human action. It is, in this sense, practical because it is disinterested in any type of knowledge that is unconnected with humanity or of no help with shaping one's character or making judgments about the good life or how to find the good or the true, and so on. Cicero continues his argument, writing that philosophy is the answer to the faults inherent in mankind. Philosophy is the correction of our human frailties. Quote, "The amendment of this fault, and of all our other vices and offenses, is to be sought for in philosophy. And as my own inclination and desire led me, from my earliest youth upward, to seek her protection, so under my present misfortunes I have had recourse to the same port from whence I set out, after having been tossed by a violent tempest. O philosophy, thou guide of life, thou discoverer of virtue and expeller of vices, what had not only I myself, but the whole life of man been without you? To you it is that we owe the origin of cities. You it was who called together the dispersed race of men into social life. You united them together, first by placing them near one another, then by marriages, and lastly by the communication of speech and languages. You have been the inventress of laws. You have been our instructress in morals and discipline. To you we fly for refuge. From you we implore assistance. And as I formerly submitted to you in a great degree, so now I surrender up myself entirely to you. For one day spent well and agreeably to your precepts is preferable to an eternity of error. Whose assistance then can be of more service to me than yours, when you have bestowed on us tranquility of life and removed the fear of death?" End quote. So Cicero seeks philosophy as the cure for human frailty. And why? Because nothing can be of greater value to us than to secure tranquility. And whether this itself is the highest good, or whether the highest good is virtue and we merely arrive at tranquility as a beneficial effect of seeking the good, for Cicero the point is that philosophy it represents a kind of salvation. More than this, Cicero seems to account the development of civilization to philosophy herself. After all, as the myths tell us, Zeus, or in the case of the Romans, Jupiter, gave man justice so that he could live together in cities. So we need a concept of justice in order to have a social life. And in that social life, we live according to law and not according to whim or to sentiment. And here Cicero calls philosophy the inventress of all laws. So philosophy is at the root of all jurisprudence. This is the legislatory element of philosophy that Nietzsche thought was central to the philosopher's activity, the great philosopher, the true philosopher. And it's worth noting that Plato also sees in philosophy the act of legislation. Even in giving names to things, we assign a value to them. We legislate a value. Indeed, Cicero also attributes communication by speech and language to philosophy. Perhaps this is because of its name-giving power. But above all, philosophy is how we learn moral discipline, how we learn virtue, and that is where we find refuge from the suffering of the world. Nevertheless, up to this point, from these musings, it may be difficult to see what exactly the definitive trait of philosophy is supposed to be. Is it simply ethical teachings? But philosophy certainly expands beyond that, into an exploration of knowledge more generally. In fact, it begins in Greece with the natural philosophers, cosmologists like Thales, who theorized not so much, if even at all, about ethics, but primarily about metaphysics and physics, and the study of those things was kind of blurred in those days. So then, is philosophy simply the activity of trying to pursue knowledge? Is knowledge what is constituted by wisdom, as if the philosopher is a lover of wisdom? Is this act of legislating values the core thing about philosophy? Is philosophy about assigning names and worth to things? Whatever our answer to this question may be, that answer also is a determination of the worth of philosophy. Anytime somebody inquires, what is philosophy? Who is the philosopher? And philosophers love to ask that question over and over and over again. Included within that is a question about the value of philosophy. What is it worth? What does it do for us? How is it to be justified? Cicero gives a very brief account of philosophy's origins before he gets to his answer, or what seems to be his answer to this question. He sees the origins of philosophy, the most distant origins, in the 7 wise men of ancient Greece, often called the 7 sages, one of whom was Thales, but they were each attributed an aphoristic saying. Cicero then raises the examples of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of the Spartans, and Homer, the writer of the Iliad and the Odyssey, other ancient figures who could be counted among the wise. Is philosophy then simply wisdom? Isn't the name simply the lover of wisdom? But then what then is wisdom? What is it that is constituted by the wisdom sought by the philosopher? To answer this question, Cicero cites the philosopher Heraclitus Ponticus, and the story that Ponticus relates regarding the origins of the term philosopher. He tells us that the first one to use the term was Pythagoras. Later classicists, among them Friedrich Nietzsche, regarded it as a sort of historical irony that the man from whom we get the name philosopher was a very different kind of man than Cicero or Carneades, or even Plato or Socrates. Pythagoras was a religious figure. He purported himself as having been given a gift from Mercury, that he would remember his past lives. And so Pythagoras claimed that there was this whole chain of past lives, that each of which had had a memory of the previous lives that he'd lived, going all the way back to the Trojan War. He claimed that at that time he was a warrior named Euphorbus from Troy, who was wounded by Menelaus, and in fact he claimed he had past lives going back beyond this. He also had claimed to have visited the underworld and returned to the realm of the living. And ultimately, I believe his claim was that he was an incarnation of the god Apollo. Nietzsche acknowledged the immense importance that Pythagoras had for the philosophers who came after him, not so much in the sense of his ideas, or rather his doctrines, but in the sense of a type, the image of life presented by Pythagoras. Now, you're probably familiar with many of the ideas of the Pythagoreans, who were his followers, but these ideas like the Pythagorean theorem and theories about music and geometry, from my understanding, scholars are fairly well agreed that all of that came later. Pythagoras doesn't really operate as a philosopher. He doesn't really subject his views to doubt or suspend his judgment in order to find a more certain truth, like an academic skeptic might do. He isn't known for the dialectic like Socrates. He doesn't make ironclad logical arguments like Parmenides. What Pythagoras does is he gathers a religious following, and it's said he always carried himself with a kind of religious solemnity. It was his countenance, his bearing, that really seemed to make such a profound impression upon the Greek world and held his followers sort of enthralled. Pythagoras taught the doctrine of metempsychosis, the transmigration of the soul into new bodies after death. Our existence in this world of matter and flesh and carnal desires is to be accounted as of little importance. The main thing of importance is how you conduct yourself while you're here. In other words, your character or your virtue. The rest that you have or come to possess while you're here is merely temporary. Now, I just argued that it is not the doctrines of Pythagoras that really influence the other philosophers, but many of the notions in Pythagoreanism are very religiously influential. It's a repeated theme in many religions in the Hellenic world and beyond, that this material world is only a veil and there's a real world of spirit behind things. The reason I would argue that Pythagoras becomes so important to the history of philosophy, and this is again sort of following the arguments of Nietzsche, by the way, it's not really my own original argument, but the image of life that he makes possible leads to a certain attitude towards life. And this comes directly out of his doctrines of the transmigration of the soul, but you don't really need to believe literally in the transmigration of the soul in order to find this attitude towards life compelling. It is the attitude that has been compelling rather than the doctrines, and that was what was compelling for Cicero. And the story that Cicero cites that gives us the origin of the term philosopher conveys this underlying attitude. He writes, quote, "All who occupied themselves in the contemplation of nature were both considered and called wise men, and that name of theirs continued to the age of Pythagoras, who is reported to have gone to Phlius, as we find it stated by Heraclitus Ponticus, a very learned man and a pupil of Plato, and to have discoursed very learnedly and copiously on certain subjects with Leon, prince of the Phliasii. And when Leon, admiring his ingenuity and eloquence, asked him what art he particularly professed, his answer was that he was acquainted with no art, but that he was a philosopher. Leon, surprised at the novelty of the name, inquired what he meant by the name of philosopher, and in what philosophers differed from other men. On which Pythagoras replied, quote, that the life of man seemed to him to resemble those games which were celebrated with the greatest possible variety of sports and the general concourse of all Greece. For as in those games there were some persons whose object was glory and the honor of a crown, to be attained by the performance of bodily exercises, so others were led thither by the gain of buying and selling, and mere views of profit. But there was likewise one class of persons, and they were by far the best, whose aim was neither applause nor profit, but who came merely as spectators through curiosity, to observe what was done, and to see in what manner things were carried on there. And thus, said he, we come from another life and nature unto this one, just as men come out of some other city to some much frequented mart, some being slaves to glory, others to money. And there are some few who, taking no account of anything else, earnestly look into the nature of things. And these men call themselves studious of wisdom, that is, philosophers. And as there it is the most reputable occupation of all to be a looker-on without making any acquisition, so in life the contemplating of things and acquainting oneself with them greatly exceeds every other pursuit of life." End quote. This story was not just related by Heraclitus Ponticus. It can also be found in Diogenes Laertius's account of the life of Pythagoras, for example. We only know it through secondary sources. Cicero's inclusion of the story here is, in my opinion, its most interesting appearance when we bring it into context with the rest of the text and the period of Cicero's life in which he's writing. The fifth Tusculan disputation specifically concerns itself with the subject of whether or not virtue is sufficient for a happy life. Cicero's interlocutors seem to agree that virtue may be necessary to live a happy life, but nevertheless, the worst turns of the wheel of fortune would seem to be incompatible with happiness. Can we really say that a man in prison or stretched on the rack or put into the bowl of Phalaris is happy? And I'd recommend that all of you go and read the full text of, especially part 5 of the Tusculan Disputations, for the full argument in this respect. All of the arguments are really kind of interrelated, though. The summary I would give, though, is that ultimately virtue is the only thing both necessary and sufficient for a happy life, according to Cicero. Virtue gives us the power to triumph over the external stirrings of our passions, the negative feelings or opinions we have about events that happen to us. This is what causes us to suffer. And while there's all sorts of interpretations as to why this is or how one goes about, like what's the method for dealing with this, it is funny that this has been such a repeated theme this season of the podcast, right? You can find this in Spinoza, you can find it to some extent in the Taoists, you can find it in the skeptics, the Stoics, so many versions of this idea. But if we separate the external impressions from those feelings we have about them, then almost by definition we don't suffer. In a way, this view contains the funny claim that pain in and of itself doesn't hurt so much as our feelings about the pain, perhaps fear connected to it, or mental distress connected to it. Cicero also argues that it is not material wealth, luxury, or pleasure that makes people happy, because, as we ought to know, there are examples of people who attain all of those things and they're still miserable. Happiness can't be tied to the turnings of fortune, at least the wise do not tie it to that. Because even at the top of the wheel of fortune, you can be unhappy, and meanwhile it seems that some at the bottom are happy. It's the power of reason to stop us from being perturbed. That's the power of philosophy, and that's what we train ourselves to do in the practice of virtue, and in recognition of the value of virtue above all these impermanent gains and losses in the material sense. Cicero writes in section 15, quote, "As the perturbations of the mind make life miserable, and tranquility renders it happy, and as these perturbations are of two sorts, grief and fear, proceeding from imagined evils, and as immoderate joy and lust arise from a mistake about what is good, and as all these feelings are in opposition to reason and counsel, when you see a man at ease, quite free and disengaged from such troublesome commotions, which are so much at variance with one another, can you hesitate to pronounce such a one a happy man?" End quote. So the happy man is free from perturbations, not someone who's in pleasurable ecstasies and luxury and so on. And it's not even someone who's free from privations, right? It's somebody who's free from the perturbations caused by those privations, the mental perturbations. And in the following section, Cicero continues, quote, "I forbear to mention riches, which, as any one, let him be so unworthy, may have them, I do not reckon among goods, for what is good is not attainable by all. I pass over notoriety and popular fame, raised by the united voice of knaves and fools. Even things which are absolute nothings may be called goods, such as white teeth, handsome eyes, a good complexion, and what was commended by Heraclitus when she was washing Ulysses' feet, the softness of his skin and the mildness of his discourse. If you look on these as goods, what greater encomiums can the gravity of a philosopher be entitled to than the wild opinion of the vulgar and the thoughtless crowd?" End quote. So let's now consider, in light of this, the description given by Pythagoras. The life of man is like these games, at which some play for glory or recognition, some play or bet or wager for money and riches, and some spectate, and Pythagoras says, simply standing back and watching, spectating. That is the best pursuit in life. This is the good life, to be a spectator rather than a participant. Even if perhaps we could even kind of modify this, right? Even if you're forced to be a participant, to recognize what that participation actually constitutes, to recognize that this life is just a place that one is visiting. as in when some sailors make port in a city and they visit the marketplace and then they set sail and depart off to the next place. Life should be regarded that way. And from that vantage point, you will not be willing to put too much stock or value into material gain or social prestige. Whether we agree with this assessment of the good life or not, we might say that the words of Pythagoras suggest an understanding of wisdom itself as the understanding of the good life. The one who is not just knowing, but wise, is the one who knows the right way to live. In the Pythagorean account, the right way to live is as a spectator. We could imagine other judgments about the best way of life, other presentations of the image of the good life. But it's this I just want to bring out this idea contained within it, that wisdom is knowledge of the good life. It's a specific kind of knowledge. So even as Cicero traces philosophy back to inquiries regarding natural philosophy, these attempts to know the truth about the natural world, perhaps they're still valuable to philosophy insofar as it develops our reason or expands our knowledge such that we can come closer to that really valuable knowledge, which is the knowledge about the right way to live. That's where the worth of philosophy is to be found. That's the way philosophy is justified. Now, I think it's worth considering why one might think that the best life is that of one who simply watches, who simply observes, who inquires into what's going on, tries to achieve an understanding rather than trying to find a basis for action. In fact, this is a very old idea. It's, in fact, a pre-philosophical idea. In the Hellenic culture, there existed this notion of the gods as spectators of the human drama. Even the fact that I just called our mortal existence a drama implies the existence of an audience to behold that drama. It's a kind of theatrical interpretation of existence that Nietzsche gave voice to in Birth of Tragedy. That book is concerned with the genealogy of dramatic tragedy in the Greek world. It comes out of religious ritual. Originally, there was the Dionysian dithyramb, a poem, a solo poem, spontaneous, drunken. Then the dithyrambic chorus. Then the inclusion of masked actors that enacted the drama, upon which the chorus comments and interprets. In so many words, Nietzsche discovered a connection between the religious and the aesthetic. The impulse to dramatize emerges out of these songs, these poems of the mystery cults. Thus, tragedy is born out of the spirit of music, and that the drama was originally solely chorus, solely music. Originally, the masked actors portrayed solely the subject of these songs, Dionysus and his destruction and rebirth. Eventually, the tragedy evolves to portray the tragic themes of this mystery teaching through other characters and stories, moving beyond Dionysus. But as such, there was always an association between actors and the theater itself and the god Dionysus. He is indeed the god of theater. Now, according to Nietzsche, the dramatic tragedy was not experienced as an escapist romp, nor even as a catharsis. Nietzsche rejects Aristotle's explanation that tragedy purges negative emotion. Rather, this was an aesthetic revelation of the primordial pain and suffering of existence, but coupled with an affirmation of existence, the knowledge that Dionysus, the god of life, or we might say of vitality, of liveliness, of sensation and impulses, the stuff of life, he will always be born again anew after every time he is destroyed. And so, as these tragedies develop and eventually portray the stories of Oedipus, Agamemnon, Antigone, and so on, the Greeks get to experience themselves as spectators of the human drama rather than actors in it. And I mean that literally. This is the actual birth of drama, at least in Western civilization. Nietzsche actually spends a good deal of the text arguing against this notion that some held that the chorus was supposed to represent the ideal spectator. And this is part of a broader struggle over the meaning of the chorus and the chorus's role in the drama, but also with the Schopenhauerian view of art, in which art is evaluated from the perspective of the audience or the spectator. And it's very important for Nietzsche that the audience themselves are transformed by the drama, that they didn't experience the tragedy as something metaphorical or unreal that they could safely stand aside from. He insists that the experience of tragedy was an experience with the real, or at least that's how it was perceived. Nietzsche writes, quote, "The spectator, excited to Dionysian frenzy, saw the god approaching on the stage, a god with whose sufferings he had already become identified. He involuntarily transferred the entire picture of the god, fluttering magically before his soul, to this masked figure, and resolved its reality, as it were, into a phantasmal unreality. This is the Apollonian dream state, in which the world of day is veiled, and a new world, clearer, more intelligible, more striking than the former, and nevertheless more shadowy, is ever born anew in perpetual change before our eyes." End quote. And so, in comparison to the tragedy playing out on the stage, the Greek tragedy is so powerful that it makes the whole rest of the world external to it seem unreal. And that's where we get this notion of Dionysus as a god of illusions. He's a god who can make his revelers believe that the world is a certain way that it is actually not. Because, again, he has this theatrical role. Nietzsche even goes so far as to ask whether it's possible that whole cultures could share in the same mass hallucinations. Much of this may seem hard to wrap our heads around, and the arguments in Birth of Tragedy are very complex. At times, they are somewhat opaque. But for our purposes, I think the key point is Nietzsche's assertion that tragedy created a dramatic world that was clearer and more intelligible than our own, and in which one could become absorbed and forget it was only a representation. And so one takes on the position of one of perhaps the satyrs, those half-man, half-animal beings who live forever in a wild existence beyond the chronological timekeeping of civilizations, and who from, on high or up on their hillside, watch the trials and travails of mortals. That was supposed to be sort of the feeling of the amphitheater, right? Is that you are raised above the action, looking down upon it. And then to do so, to perceive the action, the drama on the stage, as something real, and become invested in the characters, and become moved by the drama. We can find this idea of the gods as spectators of the human drama in Homer's Iliad. It's by far the most famous example of this trope in the Greek culture. But it must be said that the gods are not spectators in the Iliad because they're uninterested in the conflict of the Trojan War. In fact, they take sides in the conflict, and it's not as if they resolve not to intervene. At several points in the story, they do take part in the action, up to and including fighting one another. So, for example, in Book 4, it seems as though the conflict is over after the victory of Menelaus over Paris in single combat. Zeus seems satisfied to let the war come to an end, but Hera and some of the other gods, mainly Athena, they want the war to continue. Why? Well, Hera's reasons involve her hatred for Troy and her desire to destroy it. She offers Zeus the right to destroy 3 other cities that he would like to destroy in exchange, and he eventually agrees to this. Athena is sent down to Earth. She causes a Trojan to shoot an arrow at Menelaus, and she also makes it so that the shot will not kill him. So the truce is broken, the war is back on. But really, why is the war back on? And I would argue it's for a deeper reason than Hera's antipathy for the Trojans. The war must go on because, as we know from that old adage of show business, the show must go on. The gods create a better spectacle for themselves. They intervene, but in order to continue the spectacle. Usually when people invoke the idea of gods being merely spectators in the Iliad, they're thinking of the scene near the climax of the story, the duel between Achilles and Hector, where Zeus favors one side, he favors Hector, or he has a great deal of love for Hector, but he does nothing. Ultimately, Achilles chases Hector 3 times around the walls of Troy, which is somewhat humiliating, and when Hector chooses to finally turn and fight him, Achilles overcomes him and kills him in combat. And Achilles was, of course, enraged at the death of his friend Patroclus, having resisted even becoming involved in the war due to his interpersonal drama with Agamemnon. The gods watch as Achilles chases Hector, and Zeus, in spite of how he favors Hector, does not intervene on his behalf. But once again, it's not the story of the gods merely watching without being involved. In fact, Zeus at first asks the other gods, "Shall we do nothing to help this man?" Quote, "And now the father of the gods and men turned to the rest and said, 'How sad that this beloved man is hunted around the wall before my eyes. My heart is touched for Hector. He had burned thigh flesh of oxen for me often, high on Ida, at other times on the high point of Troy. Now Prince Achilles, with devouring stride, is pressing him around the town of Priam. Come, gods, put your minds on it. Consider whether we may deliver him from death, or see him, noble as he is, brought down by Peleus' son Achilles.' Gray-eyed Athena said to him, 'Father of the blinding bolt, the dark storm cloud, what words are these? The man is mortal, his doom fixed long ago. Would you release him from his painful death? Then do so, but not all of us will praise you.' Zeus, who gathers clouds, replied, 'Take heart, my dear and honored child. I am not bent on my suggestion, and I would indulge you. Act as your thought inclines. Refrain no longer.'" End quote. So once again, Athena intervenes. And Zeus clearly had the option to intervene. He chooses to sort of throw it to a vote, and after getting some pushback from Athena, he says, "Okay, fine. I'll indulge you. Act as your thought inclines." And she does. She helps Achilles kill him in a sort of magical way. But so it's a choice on the part of Zeus not to intervene, is what I'm getting at here. In the case of Hera, in the earlier scene, you kind of get the impression there's like some bargaining going on. Here, he kind of just decides, or is perhaps persuaded by the arguments of Athena, that he will not intervene. In fact, he'll let her intervene for the other side. And her argument is that this man's doom was fixed long ago. And this is a really key notion, the idea that the Moira, fate, sits above both gods and mortals. The gods cannot change what is written in fate any more than mortals are able to do so. Something foolish, maybe even a bit farcical about attempting to challenge fate, even if you're the father of all the gods and men. And all men, of course, are mortal, and so she may simply be referring to here the fact that eventually Hector will die. You can't prevent that. Might as well be here, right? It is the fate of all mortals to die. You, Zeus, cannot change that. Now, on the other side of that coin, Athena favors the Achaeans over the Trojans. Is she not invoking fate in order to gain her desired outcome? And if Hector's fate was truly sealed, then why does she have to participate in bringing it forth? I mean, you could say that she's fated to do so, but I would find that response somewhat unsatisfying. I think we can approach this another way. The question, I think, is not about whether the Olympians are pure spectators. That sort of puts us back into that, what Nietzsche was criticizing, right, of the ideal spectator and what that means. Because it's obvious that the gods clearly try to push things one way or the other. What's important is that they're engaged, attentive, and invested in the drama playing out between mortals. These are beings to whom they're totally superior in the mythology of Greece. Zeus can just zap a mortal man with a lightning bolt. Hera could transform you into all sorts of unpleasant things. Poseidon could sink your whole navy. The power of mortals is nothing compared to the gods, and yet the gods are engaged in this struggle. They're interested in how these wars and conflicts between mortals will play out. And so they pick sides, which I think reveals something. Okay, the spectators at a sporting event, at a football game, you don't have a bunch of neutral spectators or ideal spectators who dispassionately watch the Patriots and Seahawks duke it out at the Super Bowl. The stands are filled with partisans for each side. And many of those people, if they could, I think would influence the game so that their own team could win. If you ask them, they'll tell you. Maybe they have their own magic rituals for trying to affect the outcome of the game, right? Like people who wear their team's jersey for good luck. It's a bit of a silly notion, but I'm sure that most people don't literally believe that. But even the wishful thinking involved is a bit telling, isn't it? You're saying, if such a thing as luck exists, we might say fortune, and you could influence it in some way, you would do so that the team that you favor in the competition would win the contest, would win the game. If it's wishful thinking, we still reveal something about ourselves in our wishes. And so the way the Greek gods are portrayed as spectators is actually a rather accurate representation of how people spectate. We like certain characters and we want them to succeed. It's the same feeling we all have when we like the protagonist in a film. We want to see them overcome their obstacles and eventually triumph. Maybe we dislike other characters and we want them to suffer a terrible fate. I mean, if you think about Joffrey in Game of Thrones, a bunch of people hated that character. They wanted to see him die horribly. But even a character you really like, you can get a kind of enjoyment out of seeing their tragic death, which seems strange when you say it out loud, but I think if you reflect on it, I think we'll recognize the truth of that. And that recalls the insights of Birth of Tragedy, that there is a superordinate joy in seeing a noble character nevertheless meet their downfall. And that, for Nietzsche, accounts for the desire for tragedy. And I think we'll see that even in stories in which the protagonist succeeds and does not meet their downfall, the story would be boring without conflict. That's the number one thing that screenwriters will advise. In telling prospective screenwriters how to sharpen up their stories, the story is driven by conflict. I believe it was Kerouac who said, you should make your character want something immediately in your story, even if it's just a glass of water. Now, of course, character wants a glass of water. How's he going to get it? That's not a very interesting conflict. Maybe add the detail that the character wants water and he's in the middle of a desert, searching for an oasis. Immediately becomes a little more interesting. Maybe he's searching for an oasis, dehydrated for days, and now just when he catches sight of the oasis, he thinks his salvation is at hand. On the horizon, he sees bandits riding towards him, and maybe he can't tell if they're real or a mirage. Every complication, every obstacle, every opposing force with which a protagonist is faced, that makes the story more engaging, more interesting. But this also makes the protagonist suffer all the more. So the interest that we have in the story is fueled to some extent by the heightened strife that the character experiences. Now, suppose again that the story is real life and that divine beings from on high are watching our story. Would they desire that the sum total of strife, of human suffering, be increased so as to heighten the drama of the story? Even if they like the characters, maybe even especially if they like the characters. Because if you don't care about the character at all, it's not interesting when they suffer. And so there's this strange theodicy that comes out of the theatrical view of the world. The gods are the witnesses of everything that goes on in the world of mortals, meaning that all that happens is beheld by the eyes of the divine. It's therefore remembered by beings who will outlast all mortals. And so the suffering in life, the conflict and the strife of human life is given meaning and justified by the fact that there is a divine witness to it. Birth of Tragedy was at the beginning of Nietzsche's career and is primarily a work of philology. But Nietzsche would again write on this topic near the end of his productive career. This is in Genealogy of Morals, and it's from Essay 2, Section 7. Quote, "It is at any rate certain that even the Greeks knew no more piquant seasoning for the happiness of their gods than the joys of cruelty. What, do you think, was the mood with which Homer makes his gods look down upon the fates of men? What final meaning have at bottom the Trojan War and similar tragic horrors? It is impossible to entertain any doubt on the point. They were intended as festival games for the gods, and insofar as the poet is of a more godlike breed than other men, as festival games also for the poets. It was in just this spirit and no other that at a later date the moral philosophers of Greece conceived the eyes of God as still looking down on the moral struggle, the heroism and the self-torture of the virtuous. The Heraclitus of duty was on a stage and was conscious of the fact. Virtue without witnesses was something quite unthinkable for this nation of actors. There would never on the stage of this free will world be a dearth of really new, really novel and exciting situations, plots, and catastrophes. A world thought out on completely deterministic lines would be easily guessed by the gods, and would consequently soon bore them. Sufficient reason for these friends of the gods, the philosophers, not to ascribe to their gods such a deterministic world. The whole of ancient humanity is full of delicate consideration for the spectator, being as it is a world of thorough publicity and theatricality, which could not conceive of happiness without spectacles and festivals. And, as has already been said, even in great punishment there is so much which is festive." End quote. And so we come to the point. The greatest horrors of human life are a festival game for the gods. That is the point of view of Homer. And I think it is worth noting that the Greeks ascribed great importance to games. They engage in all sorts of activities with a playful and competitive element, from childhood up to old age. They play drafts, they compete to throw the javelins or the discus, they create the Olympics, they compete with one another at their symposia. When Patroclus dies in the Iliad and is cremated, the Achaeans, according to their custom, compete in games against one another. Foot races, archery and wrestling, and single combat and disc throwing and so on. And this is at a funeral. And part of the ritual custom is to engage in competitive gaming at this solemn moment. So to call human suffering a game is not to trivialize it. Games were very important to the Greeks. They were, in fact, sacred. And we might recall that Nietzsche, in the Death of God passage, the Madman passage, asks us which sacred games or what sacred games might we have to invent. So to move on into a new valuation with a new image of the sacred, we'll also need new sacred games. But to return to this passage in the genealogy, Nietzsche argues that later, the moral philosophers, the Greeks who practiced philosophy not as cosmologists, to study the natural world, but as lovers of wisdom, seeking the knowledge of the good life, they conceived the eyes of God as looking down on our world as a moral struggle. In some ways, a very similar idea to the Olympians as witnesses, but it's transformed by moral thinking. And we arguably have this same idea continuing up to the present day in Christianity. The idea that all one's deeds are seen, recorded, and logged by a divine consciousness. The Christian God, not unlike the Olympians, is also invested in the conflict. The Christian God has a certain moral narrative that he's trying to achieve as part of his divine plan. To this extent, the modern-day Christian who lives with that sense that God is watching his every action is still just as much of an actor as an ancient Greek, that nation of actors. There's no virtue for him without a witness. Everything is divinely witnessed. But notice, too, that Nietzsche says that the poet is a more godlike breed than other men, and thus it was his festival, too. Why? Because like Homer, the one who writes the story, right, who records it and retells it and interprets it in a lyrical form, by assuming the role of the storyteller or the mythologer or even the historian, you're assuming a kind of godlike surveying perspective over the action that's playing out. Even if the poet sometimes intervenes in the story by perhaps making an intervention in the sense of how he wishes to interpret it, as to sort of foster a certain narrative, his favored narrative, just as the gods may intervene by magical means so that certain mortals will triumph. But the fact remains, the dramatic poet is not the actor of the tale. He's the one who tells it, the one who records it. And the other figure that Nietzsche sets aside is the philosopher. The philosophers are the friends of the gods. And Nietzsche's comments on the philosopher here certainly present the philosopher in a different light than Pythagoras would. But we can gather from this passage by implication that the philosopher is perhaps similarly godlike, or if not godlike, God-adjacent, because of this act of standing aside and observing, interpreting, and inquiring. Now, Nietzsche brings this forward as perhaps a criticism that the philosophers have interpreted free will into their view of the world because of the delicate consideration for the spectator. Frankly, a deterministic world is boring. If the world's fate could be fully determined from the moment of its beginning, the gods wouldn't be invested in the outcome of these struggles. We might also recall Nietzsche's remarks, therefore, that often the philosopher is a type of priest, because in this case the philosopher is reifying the widespread love of theatricality and publicity. Now, how do we understand all of this? One of my favorite passages from Nietzsche is in Twilight of Idols, where he writes, quote, Aristotle says that in order to live alone, a man must either be an animal or a god. The third alternative is lacking. A man must be both, a philosopher. End quote. So Nietzsche gives us his own definition of a philosopher here, a combination of animal and god. So the philosopher is both an animal, what is inhuman, what is base, what is beneath the human, and a god, what is superhuman or above the human. The philosopher, as a rule, does not transcend the activity of the rest of nature. That is, the fulfillment of impulse. Maybe some exceptions do, but in general, the philosopher as a rule does not. And because nature, what natural beings do, is simply to blindly fulfill impulse, and Nietzsche argued explicitly against the idea that fulfilling impulse, accompanied by the conscious gloss of the intellect, as he calls it, he denied that that was any improvement over nature or any kind of transcendence of it. He insists that the philosophers are merely telling the stories of their impulses. Their most abstruse metaphysical philosophies can be sourced to their impulsive activity. That's the sense in which the philosopher is an animal. But the philosopher also has this godlike aspect. And where does Nietzsche see it most clearly? Well, in the need for solitude, one of Nietzsche's virtues. That's where he sees the animal and the god counterposed together. Why solitude? Because in solitude, one stands aside, one stands away from the goings-on of the broader world and public life. The mutual recognition and competitions of the moment, struggles for fame, struggles for material things. To the extent that the philosopher is a type suited to bear solitude, therefore, he is at least closer to the gods, perhaps simply a friend of the gods. What the philosopher and the gods have in common, the basis of their friendship, is this preoccupation with spectating. The life of man seems to the philosopher to be just a game. That doesn't mean that it's not sometimes interesting. That doesn't mean that there's not a great struggle or great suffering involved, real suffering. It doesn't mean that the philosopher doesn't take sides. But in the same way that the gods look down on mortal life from on high as the activities of inferior beings and consider the outcome of the struggle between them not as an existential matter, right? So if the Achaeans don't defeat the Trojans, it's not as if Zeus is going to be deposed or something like that. That's just not even on the table, right, in the Iliad. It's a matter, we might say, of aesthetic preference, or just impulsive, just a matter of taste, right? So the gods are able to stand back and observe and appreciate the struggle without being, they can be very invested in it and attentive to it and engaged with it, but not on that level that we might be very invested and engaged in something if we feel that it poses an existential threat to us, which is not the case for the gods. And so like them, the philosopher stands back from the world. They stand back from the canvas of reality, and they try to take in the whole picture, observe everything that happens, and understand its inner workings. And as such, even as he may sometimes be interested or invested in what's going on around him, rooting for one side or another in the game, fundamentally he's not playing the game, or at least he's not engaged on the same terms. If we want another image of this attitude about life from among the pre-Socratics, maybe one who would be more after Nietzsche's own heart, The best example is Heraclitus. And I think some of the remarks Nietzsche made in his unfinished essay, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, would be helpful here, and this is section 7. Quote, "If one would ask Heraclitus the question, why is fire not always fire? Why is it now water, now earth? Then he would only just answer, it is a game. Don't take it too pathetically, and still less morally. Heraclitus describes only the existing world and has the same contemplative pleasure in it which the artist experiences when looking at his growing work. Only those who have cause to be discontented with his natural history of man find him gloomy, melancholy, tearful, somber, atrabiliarious, pessimistic, and altogether hateful. He, however, would take these discontented people, together with their antipathies and sympathies, their hatred and their love, as negligible, and perhaps answer them with some such comment as, dogs bark at anything they do not know, or to the ass, chaff is preferable to gold." End quote. And those aphorisms that Nietzsche cites of Heraclitus are meant to show the relativity of things, the relative value of objects or phenomena according to perspective. Nietzsche, of course, also references this trope of Heraclitus as the weeping philosopher. He thinks this is a totally later retcon, which it was. Heraclitus is not an inherently melancholy philosopher. He only appears that way to those who are discontented with mankind. For those who rely on a moral story or a religious story about mankind as a theodicy, to take that away would make mankind appear as a pretty shabby and unimpressive animal. Perhaps, to use Nietzsche's language, the resentful animal, the guilty animal. But Nietzsche doesn't see Heraclitus this way, in this melancholy way. He sees him as a carefree philosopher, and he thinks that comes through when Heraclitus writes, for example, that time is a child playing drafts. The kingly power is a child's. The implication is that the organizing principle of the cosmos, if we can call it that, is naive and innocent. The cosmos is just playing, having fun. Don't take it too seriously. It is all just a game. And given everything we've talked about so far, I think we can see how you could call this a godlike perspective on things. Now, with all of this in mind, let's return, finally, to the Tusculan Disputations. If wisdom is knowledge of the good life, then on what basis does Cicero make the judgment that the life of the philosopher is the best way to live, in contrast to those who throw themselves into the game with the intention of gaining money or prestige? I'm sure many of you know the story of the sword of Damocles. I have referenced it on the podcast in the past, and this is, in fact, where that story comes from. It's probably from an earlier source, almost assuredly, but Cicero is the one who popularizes it. We all know the story of the sword of Damocles. It's almost become a cliche, but why does Cicero present it? What is the context within his argument? What is the function that this example serves? Cicero relates to us the story of the tyrant of Syracuse named Dionysius. He ruled for 38 years and had absolute power over the populace. As far as competitors go in the game of life, Dionysius did pretty well for himself. Relative to his era, he had more power and riches than most people will ever know, total control over a whole city. But Cicero describes how he couldn't trust anyone, including his closest friends, family members, and servants. Even for something like shaving his beard, he couldn't trust someone else to hold up a knife to his neck. He didn't visit the beds of his wives without first having the rooms searched by his personal guard. And because he couldn't trust his fellow Greeks, his bodyguard was made up of slaves. They weren't his friends, they weren't even his countrymen. Quote, "As he had surrounded the place where his bed was with a broad ditch, and made a way over it with a wooden bridge, he drew that bridge over after shutting his bedchamber door. And as he did not dare to stand on the ordinary pulpits from which they usually harangued the people, he generally addressed them from a high tower. And it is said that when he was disposed to play at ball, for he delighted much in it, and had pulled off his clothes, he used to give his sword into the keeping of a young man whom he was very fond of. On this, one of his intimates said pleasantly, 'You certainly trust your life with him,' and the young man happened to smile at this. He ordered them both to be slain, the one for showing how he might be taken off, the other for approving of what had been said by smiling. But he was so concerned at what he had done that nothing affected him more during his whole life, for he had slain one to whom he was extremely partial. Thus do weak men's desires pull them in different ways, and while they indulge one, they act counter to another. End quote. And if Cicero's description seems far-fetched, this really was the life of the Greek tyrant. Fustel de Coulanges speaks about this phenomenon in the ancient city. He says that the governments of tyrants were often like this because the tyrant didn't rule according to an ancient familial right, or they didn't have a divine religious sanction. They ruled purely by force. And in order to keep their power, they had to despoil many people of their property in order to bribe their forces, keep them content. And in doing so, they made many enemies in the process. And meanwhile, everyone knew that anyone who succeeded in killing the tyrant wouldn't really be punished for this. No one had any real loyalty to him. He would simply die and probably be replaced by someone else. That made their rule perpetually insecure and given to paranoia and rule by the iron fist. And Cicero therefore describes how this state of constant anxiety makes Dionysius unable to enjoy the most basic pleasures that even you and I can enjoy, like going and playing ball with some friends. Anyone can enjoy that, right? Even when doing this, Dionysius has to be on guard for his life. He has to, as Cicero says, effectively put himself into prison in order to safeguard his life. And he's forced sometimes to kill those that he loves out of fear for his life. And so this is a man who has everything. He owns a whole city. He owns all its inhabitants, all its riches, to use as he would see fit. And yet he ends up actively undermining and destroying his own happiness because of the fear of losing what he has or losing his life. And so we come to the story of the sword of Damocles, which I will present in an abridged form. Quote, "This tyrant, however, showed himself how happy he really was. For once, when Damocles, one of his flatterers, was dilating in conversation on his forces, his wealth, the greatness of his power, the plenty he enjoyed, the grandeur of his royal palaces, and maintaining that no one was ever happier. 'Have you an inclination,' said he, 'Damocles, as this kind of life pleases you, to have a taste of it yourself, and to make a trial of the good fortune that attends me?' And when he said that he should like it extremely, Dionysius ordered him to be laid on a bed of gold, with the most beautiful covering, embroidered and wrought with the most exquisite work. And he dressed out a great many sideboards with silver and embossed gold. He then ordered some youths, distinguished for their handsome persons, to wait at his table, and to observe his nod, in order to serve him with all that he wanted. There were ointments and garlands, perfumes were burned, tables provided with the most exquisite meats. Damocles thought himself very happy. In the midst of this apparatus, Dionysius ordered a bright sword to be let down from the ceiling, suspended by a single horsehair, so as to hang over the head of that happy man. After which he neither cast his eye on those handsome waiters, nor on the well-wrought plate, nor touched any of the provisions. Presently the garlands fell to pieces. At last he entreated the tyrant to give him leave to go, for that now he had no desire to be happy. Does not Dionysius then seem to have declared that there can be no happiness for one who is under constant apprehensions? But it was not now in his power to return to justice and restore his citizens their rights and privileges, for by the indiscretion of youth he had engaged in so many wrong steps and committed such extravagances that, had he attempted to have returned to a right way of thinking, he must have endangered his life. Yet how desirous he was of friendship, though at the same time he dreaded the treachery of friends, appears from the story of those two Pythagoreans. One of these had been security for his friend, who was condemned to die. The other, to release his security, presented himself at the time appointed for his dying. 'I wish,' said Dionysius, 'you would admit me as the third in your friendship.' What misery was it for him to be deprived of acquaintance, of company at his table, and of the freedom of conversation? Shall I not then prefer the life of Plato and Archytas, manifestly wise and learned men, to his, than which nothing can possibly be more horrid or miserable or detestable?" End quote. So the story of the sword of Damocles, it's often used as a metaphor for just anxiety about death, or the fear that accompanies the possession of great power. And it is about both of those things. But first and foremost, Cicero uses it as a direct comparison with the life of the philosopher, invoking, for example, Plato at the end of the passage. Dionysius says, "You want to know what it's like to be me, the winner of the game? This is what it's like. I have all these pleasures and material things, and I'm constantly in fear for my life." Damocles therefore learns that the life of the tyrant is not a happy life. He says effectively, if this is what your happiness is, then I don't want to be happy. I want to escape. Dionysius, of course, can't escape, but all of us reading this story are able to see the situation clearly and make our own judgment that the philosophical life is obviously manifestly happier. So this tale about Dionysius is not just about the specific pitfalls of becoming a tyrant or of attaining political power. It's a story meant to disprove the notion that wealth, fame, and power, the fruits of competition in the games of life, will make you happy. One doesn't need to live a life like Dionysius for this information to be relevant. The point is that those of you who desire to have these things, who center your life around attaining these things, that will not ever lead you to happiness. Virtue will lead you to happiness, or at least this is what Cicero would argue. Remember that Cicero's point in this passage is to argue that virtue alone is sufficient for a happy life. And so this is part of an argument showing how so many things we miscall good are not really goods from the perspective of bringing us happiness. And so many things that we call evils, pain and suffering and deprivation, are not really evils because they can't take away the happiness that virtue brings. And while that truth may be hard to see, or it might be hard to believe in day-to-day life, because we human beings are so misled by our desires, so enamored with them that we don't quite believe it when the wise man says, well, that will lead you nowhere. Well, that's the purpose of this story, to just compare the life of Plato side by side with Dionysius, and it becomes clear. It's obvious that Plato's life is happier. Therefore, Cicero argues we aspire to the philosophical life, which is revealed to be the good life. To return to Nietzsche, he would certainly raise suspicions about this view of the philosopher as necessarily more virtuous and thus necessarily happier. He says there's no pre-established connection between virtue and happiness, or between reason and virtue. Many evil men are happy, even though we discount that possibility by dismissing them as psychopaths or, some other form of aberration or something like that. Furthermore, Nietzsche would be suspicious about this notion of standing aside from the world as a kind of safeguard against the fear and anxiety that comes from participating in the drama, playing the game. The events of Cicero's life which lead him to write the Disputations are of great importance here. To put it in vulgar terms, is Cicero just coping? Well, in a way, this isn't even a question, because the idea of writing a work for the sake of consolation is quite literally a cope. He's trying to cope with his grief following the death of his daughter. Perhaps there was never a more justified situation in which to cope. But Nietzsche might say this image of what philosophy is given to us by whom? By Pythagoras, a mystic who believes in this otherworldly doctrine of the transmigration of the soul, and it's affirmed here in the Disputations by a man who is grieving and trying to escape or distract from his grief. And so Nietzsche would say that that's exactly the kind of image of philosophy that we might expect from people in those circumstances, with those backgrounds. This is the grief-stricken man's view of the good life. It's a salve for suffering, the means of coping with the rack or the torture chamber. In other words, the Stoic conception of philosophy, broadly speaking, to some extent also the ancient skeptics, as we've mentioned. Nietzsche's sense for Stoicism is that fundamentally it's a philosophy for those who need to be consoled, for those who find themselves enslaved, infirm, ground under by life, or facing death. Much of Cicero's arguments in the Disputations concern themselves with a rejection of the Epicurean standard of the good life, that the good ought to be measured in terms of pleasure. Virtually all of Cicero's claims hinge on this idea that the good is not found in pleasure, nor evil in pain, but solely in virtue, and in vice is where we find evil. And that's a counterclaim of the Stoics against the Epicureans. Now, as we've discussed in the episode I did on Epicurus, Epicurus is a philosophical hedonist. He does measure the good by pleasure, but he believes that our primary goal should be to avoid pain, avoid putting ourselves in a position whereby we will suffer. So Epicurus doesn't advocate for hedonism or excessive pleasure-seeking. He thinks you should only seek pleasures that don't increase your pain, which rules out quite a few pleasures if you think about it. The Epicureans abscond from society to the private garden, a small community of philosophical friends, and they entertain no ambitions, such as held by the tyrant Dionysius. They know, as well as Cicero, that the tyrant's pursuit is not happiness. The Epicurean account of things would be that the fear of suffering and death experienced by Dionysius outweighs any pleasure he might gain from his position in life. And so, at a glance, these two moral perspectives are actually rather similar in their practical judgments. But this is why Cicero continually returns to the problem of being happy on the rack, or being happy in the bowl of Phalaris. Epicurus would say that one shouldn't chase vain ambitions that might lead them to being put in such a situation. But once you're there, once you're on the rack, virtue isn't going to save you from suffering. In fact, the Epicureans would say death will save you from suffering. For Cicero, that's an unacceptable answer. And Nietzsche has an interesting passage on this in The Gay Science. It's number 306, entitled Stoic and Epicurean. We've discussed it before, but it becomes relevant again for a specific reason in this context. Nietzsche writes that the Stoic, quote, likes well to have an invited public at the exhibition of his insensibility, the very thing the Epicurean willingly dispenses with. He has, of course, his garden. Stoicism may be quite advisable for men with whom fate improvises, for those who live in violent times and are dependent on abrupt and changeable individuals. He, however, who anticipates that fate will permit him to spin a long thread, does well to make his arrangements in Epicurean fashion. All men devoted to intellectual labor have done it hitherto. End quote. And Cicero says a few times in this text, slavery in the ancient world is just a thing that can happen to you. It befalls not just individuals, but sometimes whole nations, according to the turnings of fortune. So, if you're a young man or young woman in a Greek city with your whole life ahead of you, and then your city loses a war and you get sold into slavery, that isn't your fault. That wasn't your doing. It would be just as if a tidal wave were to hit your city. It's a terrible thing, but it was simply bad luck. So in such a world where slavery can easily befall you, any formula for happiness based on pleasure will be badly suited to those who have to endure such evils. In changeable and violent times, Stoicism is the only thing you can really rely on. But for those who are going to spin out a long thread in life, for those whom fate has spun out a long thread for them, it's best for them to order their lives according to the wisdom of Epicurus, not seeking excessive pleasure, but avoiding unnecessary pain. Nietzsche also says it's an issue of type, right? It's an issue of how sensitive you are. The Epicurean is described as an overly sensitive type. He removes himself from the stimulus, whereas Stoicism cultivates an insensitivity towards the stimulus. But there's one final and very important element to this passage. In a way, it kind of flips the script on this whole episode. Nietzsche says that the Stoic needs an audience for his Stoicism. He likes to have an invited public at his display of insensitivity. And I can't help but think, is Nietzsche inverting the Ciceronian conception of the Stoic philosopher as the spectator? That is to say, the philosopher who holds that philosophy leads to the good life because it instructs us in virtue and strengthens us against suffering. Is he really the spectator, or is he an actor? Remember what Cicero says in his letter to Atticus. I try with all my might to attain some composure of countenance, if not of mind. He seems to have some trouble in actually consoling himself with philosophy. His book, he says, serves as a distraction. Perhaps we shouldn't take the importance of these remarks too far. I mean, a charitable interpretation would be that writing these books perhaps allows Cicero to think things through and come to know these ideas as true through his own experience or something like that. But there is another possibility. Cicero's Tusculan Disputations and his Consolatio were widely read works written by a very public intellectual and statesman. Was this a way perhaps of acting out that consolatory power of philosophy by performing as though Cicero is consoled? By portraying oneself that way through his literature, taking on the role of the Stoic philosopher, consoled by virtue, as an act, and an act for which Cicero had many spectators, many readers, many admirers. This is not to say that Cicero's pretending was not genuine. Perhaps it is by playing the part of the Stoic philosopher that Cicero can actually learn to become that type of person. But by giving voice to the consoling power of philosophy, there's another side to that, right? He's also representing himself to the world as one who must know great grief. For how else should he be qualified to speak on the matter of philosophy's power to console us while on the rack? Cicero was on a spiritual rack. He was racked by grief, and in telling us that philosophy is a consolation for his suffering, he has made us an audience to that suffering. He's made us a witness to it. By doing so, he gives meaning to his suffering, and therefore he plays the part not of a spectator, but of the actor in a tragedy. Nietzsche knew very well of the theatric elements of Greek culture and the closeness of the poet and the philosopher to the spectating gods, but I don't think he would agree that the contemplative and withdrawn life of the philosopher is better than the dangerous life of the adventurer or the tyrant or the pirate, or any of these other sorts of archetypes. Again, there is that suspicion towards philosophy itself that's usually an undertone in Nietzsche, and as we all know, Nietzsche often referenced the life of Napoleon as an example of a beautiful, we might say a theatric type of life. Instead of Plato and Dionysius, maybe we could compare Napoleon to one of his own contemporaries, say Hegel. If you want peace of mind and the simple pleasures of conversation and friendship and so on, you'd probably go for the life of Hegel. That's the one you'd rather lead. But which story would you rather like to read about or watch a film about? The life of Napoleon or the life of Hegel? One is assuredly more exciting than the other. The life of Napoleon is justified aesthetically as the story we would rather be spectators to. For Nietzsche, the very problem is that we have these philosophies that conceive of the good life as ways to avoid pain, in the case of the Epicureans, or to cope with pain, in the case of the Stoics. Whereas in Nietzsche's work, also in The Gay Science, we get that famous passage, live dangerously, be willing to perish in the pursuit of the great and impossible. Why? Well, because that's a better story. Nietzsche's judgment is that life is good, yes to life, but life involves all this suffering and grief and discontentment. The Greeks justified all of that through spectacle. They said we are witnesses to it and see the beauty in it as in a work of art. And so too, do the gods look down on us and are witnesses to our virtue and the beauty of our lives and the beauty of our struggles. And to shy away from danger or from suffering from this perspective would be to deny life its meaning and its justification. Nietzsche questions whether our goal should even be to seek a happy life. As Schopenhauer said, a happy life is impossible. All one can strive for is a heroic life. In spite of the different terms on which Nietzsche and Schopenhauer understood what constitutes the heroic life, I think Nietzsche mostly maintained this attitude. He says, man doesn't strive for happiness, only the Englishman does that. But perhaps this is to sell Cicero a bit short. Even according to Nietzsche's standards, Cicero's type of life was likely appropriate to the age in which he lived, a changeable and violent age. Not a year after he writes the Tusculan Disputations, an event that from all accounts may have seemed like salvation to Cicero probably spelled out his doom, the assassination of Julius Caesar. After Caesar's death, Cicero returned to politics. He attempted some maneuvering against Antony. He tried to play Antony against Octavius, but ultimately the two united as part of the Second Triumvirate, and Cicero found himself in the proscription list. He was killed while trying to flee the country, purportedly beheaded when sticking his head out of his carriage. We may wonder how his philosophic virtue held up in the face of death, but he made such a good show of it in life that the early Christians treated him more or less from the beginning as one of the righteous pagans. For all Nietzsche's hectoring, the most compelling consequence of Cicero's vision of philosophy, in my view, is that he arrives by his own road at a view of life that can be justifiably called a love of fate. Ultimately, Cicero is concerned with the question of whether one can say yes to life or not, and he takes it for granted that happiness is the standard by which life could be called good, and argues, therefore, we must have some way available to us of achieving happiness in all circumstances, in all turns of fate, if we are to call life good. The question for him is not whether we can, be in some blissful state all the time, but whether we can be inclined to find happiness, whether it can be considered possible to find happiness more frequently than not. Quote, even as trading is said to be lucrative and farming advantageous, not because the one never meets with any loss, nor the other with any damage from the inclemency of the weather, but because they succeed in general, so life may be properly called happy, not from its being entirely made up of good things, but because it abounds with these to a great and considerable degree. By this way of reasoning, then, a happy life may attend virtue even to the moment of execution, nay, may descend with her into Phalaris's bull, according to Aristotle, Xenocrates, Speusippus, Polemon, and will not be gained over by any allurements to forsake her. End quote. The bull of Phalaris was a horrible method of torture execution. It's nothing short of hellish. Cicero's claim, then, is that this consolatory power of philosophy can accompany you even into hell. Pain and grief and death are sure to come to all of us. If there are some destined by fate never to be happy, or never to be happy in the sense of pleasure, right? Then it would have been better for them never to have been born. Cicero cannot abide that conclusion. Instead, his proof that life is worth living is precisely that happiness can be found in virtue even within all of life's tortures and travails. It's not to be found in material accumulation or fame. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.